distinguished delegates, without much losing time, so we want to cover up, just be a little bit late by 15 minutes, so we want to cover it up. We have already Honorable Minister for Finance. He has already been arrived here, and he has taken his seat. And also the chair of this session, Dipendra Bahadur Chhetri, he also has taken his seat. So please allow me to briefly introduce both of our speakers, though I should not do it because this session to the chair of this session and then for further processing. As the chair of this session, we have Dipendra Bahadur Chhetri. Mr. Chhetri has served as a vice chairman of National Planning Commission, and he has also served as the governor of Nepal Rashtra Bank, the Central Bank of Nepal, and he was a member of the Rural Development Bank. Mr. Chhetri has in-depth knowledge of Nepal's economy, development issues, public and monetary policy. He is a strong advocate of expanding markets opportunities for the prosperity. And briefly, let me introduce the Honorable Minister for Finance, Dr. Yuvraj Khatioda. Dr. Khatioda is the Minister for Finance, Government of Nepal since February 2018. He held the position of Vice Chairman of National Planning Commission of Nepal during 2015-16 and 2019. Further, he served as the Governor of Nepal Rashtra Bank, the Central Bank of Nepal during 2010-15. He served the UN system as a senior economist in the regional center of UNDP for Asia and Pacific. He was head of Economic and Research Department at Nepal Rashtra Bank from 1999 to 2002. With this brief introduction, so the key theme of today's speech is expanding public choices and market opportunities, which is the key session. Will be one of the much awaited session for us, which will help us to expand our knowledge on the theme of this conference, expanding public choices and market opportunities. And now it's over to the chair.
For example, this morning also, only I came to know that Bhutan doubled the salary of teachers as well as the health workers. Just imagine 750,000 population, and they have enunciated happiness index throughout the world. Even the developed countries, they are very much interested. What is the mechanism? How can we translate it into practice? Similarly, in India, the local bodies, they have given enough power to exercise at the local level. Therefore, political system is more or less stable, and everyone says that broadest democracy in the world. However, there are also problems. Don't worry about that. Similarly, in Nepal, we have been practicing planning for more than 6 decades. But the outcome is not that appreciable. We should admit it. However, these sort of programs definitely help us to share with each other whatever the best practices we have generated, and we have opportunities to just let others know how we are doing this. With these words, I request Honorable Finance Minister to deliver his keynote speech. Thank you.
Expanding public choices and market opportunities. Let me thank all the organizers, including the Staff College, for hosting such an important event. As I was introduced, I am a professional central banker, a core economist, and a student of public policy, and a practitioner of public policy. So I would like to avoid theories, which you all know much better than me. But as a policy practitioner, I would like to talk something about expanding public choices and market opportunities. I would be speaking in general, but then I'll also be speaking something specific to our country, Nepal. choices are always limited. That's why we need to expand them. When we expand individual choices, we develop our human well-being and our way of living. That's what human development is all about. When you widen public choices, we widen welfare of the people and well-being of society at large and the citizens that a public entity is serving to. That could be government or any other public entity. By public, I don't only mean the government. Any other agencies who are serving as public entities, like which are subservient to the government policies, government institutions, state-owned enterprises, and several other entities which are public in nature, having the stake of the government, I take them all as public entities. So, when they have more choices, they can better deliver and they can better give the welfare results so that people become happier. The ultimate goal of all the public policy makers is to make their people happy. That's why our government also says, prosperous Nepal, happy Nepali. It's not as of tomorrow, it's a long way. But then we have to make our public choices right. We never lead to prosperity or happiness when we choose the wrong path as public policy makers. So choice of right path along with expanding the opportunities and the alternatives that we have to promote the society, the economy and welfare. I think this is what we should be talking about. There is a debate ongoing for decades on the role of state versus the market. And we're talking about two actors of the development. Missing something in between, or not understanding the role of the third sectors of development, where the public sector can have much opportunities to expand their choices. What is that? And how does that work in South Asia and particularly in Nepal? Let me start with this. Role of the government. Traditionally, that's the case, and more so from the 60s onwards, 1960s onwards, when we started planned development, so-called socialist orientation in South Asia, pulling resources for the state and allocating them as per the state's best discretion, what they say, what they claim to be the case, but not necessarily it was the best choice. So over time, we happened to fall in several problems. We saw fiscal profligacy, governments spending more than what they can benefit from. I think that was not a proper choice. Government interfering in the areas where private sector should come or could come in a much more efficient way. And governments not really understanding the role of the third actor of development, which is the community organizations, the cooperative organizations, and that includes all non-governmental organizations which are non-profit seeking entities. The role of the third sector was totally missing in our development efforts, and the choice was limited between state and the market, whereas we had some other choice. To realize this third choice, we took several decades. And thanks to Nepal's constitution, which says there are three pillars of development: the public, the private, and the cooperative and community sectors. So, expanding the actors of development itself is a broader choice. You can have more partners to work with now. You have more services and goods to deliver with the support of other entities as well, not solely depending on the market or any other entities for that matter. Now, is it always the case that we talk state versus market when you have policy choices? Is it state and market, or is it state or market? Has there always to be a trade-off between public and private sectors? Is there always a crowd out of any activity done from the public sector towards the private sector? Or in other words, does resources mobilization from the public sector always crowd out resources available to the private sector? Cannot they complement each other? Cannot they work together for the larger welfare of society and people at large? So, the theory, the development theory converging towards the role of both state and private sector, combined role in a complementary way, the public sector crowding in the private sector in several of its deliveries, which private sector could perhaps better deliver than the public sector, but not delimiting the role of the state in several other areas where private sector doesn't come with a profit incentive. Now, where does this third sector then exist? The community, the cooperatives, and other non-governmental organizations I have been talking. Government cannot reach every household. Government has a limitation. Delivering services to each and every household, that also in a fair and prompt and effective way, has been an Herculean task for the governments all over the world. Private sector goes to households when it can accumulate something back out of the service it provides. If no profit, it doesn't go. That's the value of the private sector. That's the principle of the private sector, to make money of investments made. Except for this corporate social services, there is nothing for the private sector to deliver except for paying good taxes, delivering goods and services, and making profit. So why does private sector enter into areas where there are not enough profits? So in the areas where state cannot reach, in the areas where private sector won't like to go, there is a role of the third actors of development. This is where we see greater role of our social business organizations, social mobilization organizations, community development organizations, and so on and so forth. They are our actual strength, who work at the grassroots, who work for social inclusion, and who work for socio-economic transformation. So the choice of actors is fundamental, and the notion of state work versus market has to be done away with at the present context, at least in the context of South Asia. There is coexistence and cooperation and collaboration between all these three sectors. The other issue I would like to touch upon is the issue of government failure versus market failure. We chose market because governments fail. In the 80s, we read several books saying that governments fail, but markets fail too often. That was the quote unquote. I think it was in the book Bureaucrats in Business. Many of you might have read it. But over time we saw governments fail, but markets fail too often, rather than markets fail and governments fail too often. It has been a reversal case. Look at the global financial crisis. The 1987, what we call the Black Monday, the Wall Street crisis, was a market failure. The 1997 Asian crisis was a government failure because they distorted the market. They had distorted exchange rate regime, they had distorted fiscal regime, they had distorted monetary regime, and they had their resource allocation in a not more efficient way, but they were badly managed. Perhaps the resource allocation would be one agenda we'll be talking over the next 2 days' time, how to make judicious allocation of resources. But the 1997 crisis was mainly because governments were not performing well and they were Asia-centric. And now, I'm talking the crisis one after another in a decade, 87, 97, and now 2007. By 2007, we had learned all the lessons that government should be doing what it should do and not interfering in the private market, not distorting policies, not distorting financial system, not distorting foreign exchange system, not distorting the tax system, everything fine. Asians were doing very good. Well, we thought we avoided the crisis because governments learned lessons, because they had already burned their fingers. But the crisis started July, August 2007 was all about again market failure. It's not only market failure, agencies of the market, they also failed. And several other entities who regulate the market, who govern the market, who oversight the market, and who have to give good information, right information to the public also failed. The auditing firms failed, the accounting firms failed, the supervisory bodies of the financial market failed, and even government policies were not supportive to restore stability. Then what happened? We realized that governments might work irrationally at some point, but they learn lessons. But markets oftentimes work irrationally, and market doesn't learn lesson. You have to teach lessons to the market all the time. That's why an effective state is even more important. So when we are talking about effective state, which basically I take it as a public entity, then perhaps we have to think about its choices. Today I'm supposed to speak more on allocation, resources allocation, and some other areas where we have choices. I take a couple of points. The choices are always hard. You have to choose between inclusion and efficiency. This is what I have been telling for some time now. The global development efforts that we made in the 70s, 80s through market-led process, we had good growth. We are having double-digit growth, but that led to inequality in a higher degree. The growth was jobless, the growth was said to be ruthless, the growth expanded exclusion and inequality. Many people who were supposed to get out of poverty didn't get out of poverty as per the growth we achieved. So we now realize that, well, growth is not automatically inclusive. Economic growth is not built-in inclusive. You have to have your public policies oriented to make economic growth inclusive. So how do you make it inclusive? By distributing alms or palms or some money to the households who are direly in need of money? Or are you also empowering people in that process, making growth inclusive? It's basically an issue of empowering people through public policies. So the whole concept of human development came in such a way that growth is not enough. Talking about absolute physical development is not enough. We have to talk about human development. And talking human development, we realize that there are discriminations across gender, across ethnic groups, across income groups, across geographic regions, and so on and so forth, and also across age groups and across ability, physical ability, like the extent of disability. So we started heavily talking about inclusion. And for the last 2 decades or so, inclusion has become a buzzword for all of us, that growth must be inclusive, development must be inclusive if it has to be sustainable. And the latest Sustainable Development Goals have put inclusion as the key mantra, the sutra, to see that development is sustainable. But now, my hard choice is, does this inclusion necessarily also include or ensure efficiency, which is a market condition? The notion is that market will allocate resources in the most efficient way. This is the conventional wisdom that we have been applying for years and years. But we have a lot of us who still think that market allocates resources in the most efficient way. But all of us agree that market doesn't necessarily ensure it is inclusive in terms of its deliveries. Market doesn't ensure inclusiveness in jobs, in income distribution, in providing opportunities, and anything that you talk. So, there would be a trade-off when we are having choice between the state and the market in terms of inclusion and efficiency. The other hard choice is, are they really mutually exclusive issues? Inclusion and efficiency. Can you ensure inclusion along with ensuring efficiency in the whole production process, resource allocation process, distribution process, and choosing actors of development? The only choice for us now is to see that inclusion and efficiency are integral part of the same public policy choices. They are not trade-off. So this discourse, this debate must continue on that area, that how do we ensure that we don't distort the efficiency of the market, because that's the best way to ensure that development is sustainable. Otherwise, if resources are not efficiently allocated, what happens? You accumulate resources, you overconsume capital, you overconsume labor, you overconsume natural resources, perhaps you overconsume your existing every capital. Then you produce more, but it's not sustainable because there is some trade-off. Now, we have seen the economic powerhouse of the world also being the powerhouse of generating greenhouse gas, also being the powerhouse to deteriorate the climatic conditions and contributors to climate change. So, let's think in such a way that the state policies should be such that it basically underscores the need for efficiency, but at the same time also ensures that there is social justice, ensures that there is fairness, and there is a kind of, I would say, happiness among people that they are not cheated in the development outcomes. If people feel that they are deprived of the development outcomes, if they feel that they are not treated fairly as per their share, and if they are not treated fairly as per their contribution, perhaps the development outcomes would result in a kind of conflict, a conflict which might turn on in different forms or different size and shapes. So, if you are talking peace, if you are talking about peace-sensitive development, if you are talking about development that also ensures peace, we have to see that there is satisfaction among people that in the process of making development process efficient, making resource allocation efficient, a large section of society is not excluded. They have been included in the process. That means in public decision-making process, in development or production process, implementation process, and in benefit sharing process. In all these areas, how do we ensure that people are part of the decision-making process, implementation process, and distribution process, and benefit sharing process? That is a critical choice for the public entity to make. This is how a democratic country functions, because the choice of public is reflected through the parliamentarians in the parliament. And this is why the parliament has to allocate resources where the money has to go, which is raised by taxation. Now, when it comes to public finance, which is also a matter of public choice, we have to think in terms of a regime where we have democratic governance, where we have representative system, and where no taxes are raised without being approved by the parliament, and no allocations are made without the approval of the parliaments, and government is honest enough to see that the resources so allocated by the parliament are not distorted or siphoned off for any other purpose. And that perhaps would simply mean that if you are spending money on public goods rather than on your private goods with public resources, if you spend public goods in private benefits, perhaps that is loosely defined as corruption. And perhaps the fallacy on the public sector being failure is that oftentimes resource allocations are not efficient, and they result in other kind of implications to people at large. Public resource allocation has at least 3-4 dimensions. Where do we allocate our resources? How do we do that? How do we finance our resources? And with whom we are partnering to mobilize those resources? Let me talk about allocation, the choice in allocation, which is governed by certain fundamentals of the public entity. You are an elected government. You have committed to the people through election manifesto that you will maximize the welfare of your people, of your constituency. That's why you allocate resources for their welfare maximization. The constitution might have said something in Indian country, like in Nepal, we have our constitution which says that education, health, water, sanitation, social security, right to food are our fundamental rights. So, if they are our fundamental rights, do you have a choice between the state, by state I mean the public sector at the moment, do you have a choice between the public and the private sectors to deliver the same, which are our fundamental rights? That is one issue to be discussed. Some of us say that when it is fundamental right, it becomes the primary responsibility of the public entity or the state to deliver it. You should not be overly trusting the private sector to the same. It could be health, it could be education, it could be food, safe food, it could be water sanitation, it could be small infrastructure, that includes housing. By the way, right to decent housing is also our fundamental right in Nepal. So, do you really think that the public sector should be constructing house to each and every individuals in the country? It's a choice. You can do it, you can trust the market, you can trust the community. Do you really take stock of all education and say that from primary to university education, state would be solely responsible? It's easy to make one responsible, but supporting your choice by your resources, allocation choices by your resources is a difficult task. So you have to have a prioritization in your choices. Which is your priority? If education, allocation more resources in education is your priority, of course, which is a fundamental right, then you have to prioritize your priorities as well. Within the education sector, what is your choice? Primary education, basic and secondary education, or higher education, or pre-primary education? You have to choose. Nepal has said that the basic and secondary education has to be free and has to be universal, and also basic education to be compulsory. So, that's state responsibility. But don't you have a partnership choice in that? I'll come to that point after a while. But obviously, you have to look all the possible alternatives of your service being provided to people at large. If you yourself cannot do everything, try to find partners and try to choose the right partner to work with. That's the fundamental public policy choice I'm talking. That applies to health. Primary health care is state responsibility, but when it comes to auxiliary or tertiary health care services, specialized health care services, can a developing countries in South Asia can really afford universal health care to everybody to the extent of whatever expenses they have? I think there should be a participation from Bhutan. I understand that Bhutan has universal health care system even up to the tertiary level. To some extent, Sri Lanka. I'm not very sure, but you can discuss this point. But it takes a lot of public resources. And are you necessarily entering into the business that others can do, or are you really have to enter into that business is a question. So is in housing. So this applies to several other infrastructures, like take for example some infrastructures like power generation, hydropower, solar, wind, or whatever, microhydel included, biogas included. That includes also solid waste management. Don't you think government can partner with several entities in these areas? Obviously, yes. The traditional areas which were not otherwise seen as profit-making areas are now growingly getting profit-making areas, like the solid waste management, power generation, even transmission. So, the expanding market opportunities allows government to seek for more choices and also to seek more partners, and also governments can leverage on those things to other partners, whereby itself focusing on its core activities, which otherwise other sectors, other actors are not willing to join. That is the strategic choice of the public sector. Do yourself the ones which others are not interested at all, are not feasible to participate in, and mobilize other sectors, other actors in the process where there is a market opportunity. That applies to infrastructure, which is growingly been seen as a profit-making activity. The urban development, urban infrastructures, particularly urban transportation. Not necessarily it has to be a public sector entity. We can co-work with the private sector and with other actors. But the partnership has to be credible, transparent, and on the basis of risk and benefit sharing. Passing on risk to other partner and passing on income to only one partner doesn't make partnership a credible strategy. This is where the public sector becomes often the loser. It chooses partners and then falls in a problem that the risk is taken by itself and the returns are shared with so many other entities. That's why PPP model is often seen with some kind of reservations. But I am myself still a firm believer of PPP. The issue is of how public choices are made in terms of partnership and in terms of strategic orientations. So, on resource allocation, we have to see whatever is to be allocated, it has to be allocated in such a way that it addresses the demands, the concerns of the ones which are left far behind. What do the Sustainable Development Goals say? Leave no one behind. At least bring the ones which are back of the average development to the average level. Then you will find a level playing field for everybody to grow. So, reprioritization is even more important in public choices. And when we talk prioritization, we don't talk about only sectors. If I say education is a priority, somebody might say tourism is even more priority. Agriculture, of course, is a priority. In South Asia, agriculture is the lifeline. This is not the debate we go on public discourse. What within tourism are you going to prioritize? The job creators, the ones which balance your regional development, the ones which bring in more innovations in the industry, what? Similarly, in education, I said education already. In health, what is our priorities? In water sector, what are our priorities? So, it's not the sectoral priorities I'm talking about priorities of activities which address the concern of the most backward class the first. The people who are left far behind must be addressed first. That's the key that the Sustainable Development Goals all talk about. Come to taxation. You can tax the present generation for the consumption of the present generation or for the consumption of the future generation as well. And you can tax the future generation by making your present day consumption affordable and living the present life. In Parliament, we were talking a lot about debt, how much debt we should be incurring. And there is a Sanskrit proverb which many of us in South Asia know. Yavat jivet sukham jivet, rinam kirtva ghritam pivet. Don't care how long you live, but enjoy life, bread and butter, enough, even by borrowing. If we borrow today, who pays our obligation? our borrowings as of today and consumption of today would be financed by taxation of our coming generation. Does it ensure intergenerational equity in resource sharing? It doesn't only apply to taxation, it applies to consumption of natural resources as well. You consume all the natural resources, you maximize your welfare at the present day and leave the future without those resources available to the future generation. That is not also sustainable consumption. Sustainable taxation is the one whereby if you have to consume, you raise taxes for the same generation. Just like polluters pay in terms of pollution management. So is the case. You are consuming, you must also pay tax. You are consuming and your coming generation would pay is an injustice. Similar is the case in natural resource management. The other issue on taxation is that the issue of progressivity in taxation. Whom are you taxing? It's also a public choice. And how much are you taxing is a market opportunity. If you are overly taxing the people who are working hard, perhaps you are squeezing the market opportunities to make it deliver some of your responsibilities which they might do. They would simply shy away or run away because you are taxing them too much. If you are taxing them too little, you don't have resources to make your obligations and you borrow, and now your current day borrowing would lead to your future generation tax burden. A hard choice. In borrowing also, you can borrow domestically, you can borrow externally. Borrow internally in a tight market condition like the one we have in Nepal at the moment. When you are overly borrowing as a public entity to finance your consumption, the private sector's resources would be crowded out, and then perhaps productive investments would be jeopardized, and then the issue of resource allocation and efficiency of allocation would be killed. So we have to see that any activity that the government takes to borrow from domestic market has a bearing on the private sector. It might squeeze or expand the private market opportunity accordingly. So we have to be careful on borrowing. On external borrowing or external financing, there is a choice between your borrowing and capital inflows. In either case, you need money to develop. You need money to invest more. More money you need is either through the public or through the private sector. You still have a choice again. Government can borrow more, fall in indebtedness, and perhaps maybe in a better sense use the money for infrastructure. The private sector borrows the money, does its activity, makes profit, repays the loan, or the equity goes back, the government will have nothing to do with. So, what is the comparative advantage as a public sector? You would encourage direct investment in the private sector rather than government in itself incurring huge external debt. But is it feasible in all the cases? No. There are public responsibilities without which private sector also cannot come in. The basic infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, the public sector must invest, which would then enable private sector to come in. In Nepal's case, infrastructure financing is the key issue. The SDG needs assessment says that at least the financing gap of the country is at least 6% of GDP. On an average, we have to spend 50% of GDP. Currently, we are making total investment to the tune of 44%. So, when you have a huge investment gap, that also in the areas which is not a profit-making area, then there is a need for borrowing, but then we have to develop our capacity to repay the loan once it is borrowed. So, there is not much choice in terms of South Asian countries in terms of borrowing, but we have the choice that we can make the borrowing productive, make the country able to repay it, and raise revenue base so that the countries don't have to borrow anymore. So the choices are there for us. Depends on how we allocate resources, how we implement them. Subsidies. This is another choice. Transfer and social security are other choices. Subsidies and transfers. It's good that you have handouts to everybody. Child age, you have the offering from the state. Old age, you have been benefited. With disability, you have been benefited. Unemployed, you have been benefited. But do remember that there should be somebody to pay for what you are getting. Again, if there is nobody to support what you are getting instead, that's not a prudent public policy. What we are doing then? We are borrowing for the subsidies, for the transfers, for the social security, and the borrowing will have to be paid through taxation from our next generation. So I am always asking this question to my political friends, that do the grandparents really want that their grandchild would pay the tax for what they are getting as social security? No, they won't like it. They don't even want to leave any liability, any debt to their coming generations. So our choice is to see that each and every of our social security provision is duly financed by our taxation and through the contributory system. Nepal has come to a contributory pension system, contributory social security system. All contributory social security system for the reason that it has to be made sustainable. And you should not be transferring such kind of liability to the upcoming generations. Resource allocation, it is a hard choice between being a populist and being a realist. Every politician wants to be very populist. But for how long can you maintain your populism unless you are backed by adequate resources? That is the fundamental case. As a pragmatic economist turned politician, I have also to remember that there are constraints, resource constraints to what we do as a populist government. Being populist is a good word. We have to be populist. But to deliver services, being a populist government also should have credible financing mechanisms through proper taxation system in place. And that calls for a very progressive taxation if you really want to see that there is social justice. That's why our government is putting more emphasis on direct taxes. That's a different matter. Let me come to the partnership issue again. I like this topic very much in public choices because particularly in a federal setup. In federal setup, I think Nepal, India, Pakistan, at least we have the federal setup. As the youngest federal state, Nepal, we have 761 governments. Many of us think that all these development responsibilities have to be delivered by ourselves, the state, because this is what the Constitution says, this is what we committed to the people. So we should be doing each and everything, from manufacturing to broadcasting to infrastructures to agriculture to social security, everything, blah, blah, blah. Is that the right choice? I would say no. We have again to follow the principle that whatever private sector can do in a more efficient way, let the private sector do it. Expand markets opportunities through better taxation policies, by credible macroeconomic and sectoral policies, by better governance, by setting better labor laws, and by ensuring that we are a transparent decision-making entity. Also oversee private sector if they are making supernormal profit, if they are also becoming rent-seeking entities, if they are externalizing their cost and internalizing the profit. It's easy to externalize the environmental cost and to internalize the income generated from that. So The public sector has to be vigilant, of course, on that, but let primarily trust the private sector to work in the areas where it can better deliver. Now for the public sector, I'm talking 761 entities in Nepal, in 3 tiers of the federal system. The education on that is just evolving, and private sector institutions at the provincial and local levels are also evolving to collaborate with the public sectors. I do understand that in other countries which are a bit matured federal states, they should have a better mechanism to partner with the private sector and the community and cooperative sectors. But in case of Nepal, we have yet to institutionalize many things. The other issue of choice is, should the central government do everything and let only smaller things to be done by the provinces and then by the local governments? Or do you really think that whatever is entrusted of the local governments must be timely delegated to the respective levels of the government? This is also a choice for an evolving and emerging federal system like that of Nepal. And I would say that, as per the spirit of the Constitution, the Nepal government, which is said to be federal government, must be doing what it has to do as per the Constitution, and trust other other tiers of the federal system to work accordingly as per their entrusted responsibility. In doing that, couple of things are important. How do we develop capacity as the central state? The capacity development would be important, and developing institutions, legal and regulatory framework to work with the private sector and community sectors at the sub-nationals level is equally important. We have good practices of community involvement in development and resource management in particular. The forestry group, community forestry, water management groups, user groups in several areas, local infrastructure development groups, just like any user groups. Fantastic jobs. But if in the absence of proper institutional, legal and regulatory framework, there is a risk that the ills often we see in the public sector are also transmitted to the non-governmental sector. We have to cure our diseases within the public sector, but should also ensure that there are no diseases like of the corruption and other things also in the non-governmental areas. This is also some of the institutional reform areas that the public sector will have to do. I talked about financing. Now I talk about accountability, responsibility, oversight, and saying that the resources so publicly allocated are spent in a proper way and the benefits are shared equally, equitably, and then no one feels excluded. This is the last point I would like to touch upon. The central governments often formulate the projects themselves, implement themselves, monitor themselves, evaluate themselves, and say that they have done fantastic job, good success. Is it credible? Oftentimes, the international financing institutions also did like this. They lent, they supervised, they had the oversight, but finally found that we all were in crisis. So there started to be an independent evaluation of the international financing institutions, and everything got unfolded. It was revealed that not all things were being done right. So, as a public entity, we should always be welcoming for third-party evaluation of what we have been doing. You cannot choose your work yourself, your implementation strategy yourself, your evaluation process yourself, and the conclusion also by yourself. Really, the choices would be so limited to yourself. So, it's important that you have other partners in this process. Partnership widens inclusion. Partnership enhances transparency, credibility, and perhaps partnership widens the benefit sharing also. So on that, I would say public choices have to be expanded for both reasons, for making better delivery of its responsibilities, but also for expanding market opportunities where market function in a rational way. So the ultimate goal is maximizing welfare without any rent seeking, without any jeopardization of the resources that we leave for next generation to come, so that our next generation don't blame on us that we overexploited all resources and left them in a situation of trouble. At least we have to avoid being a public entity. Let me just stop here for also the reason that I have to attend the parliament, which has already just begun. So thank you once again, and I would like to see that the cooperation in South Asian countries, particularly in sharing good practices. There are several areas whereby we have shared good practices. And also sharing the common risk associated with our cross-border governance. Also the risk associated with our public goods are bad, like the kind of environmental degradation and climate change. And like the issues of migration, social protection for migrant workers, and also keeping peace and development go together. I think in countries having shared borders, that also physical borders, perhaps we can have more collaboration. And on that, I think our public policy audits, public policy sharing, and sharing of our personal and institutional views would be critical, at least for countries like ours, where we are also looking for better governance and rapid development. So look forward to very fruitful deliberation and very successful conference, which is being engaging for the next 2 days, and that concludes my observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister Dr. Khatiwada. He has covered most of the elements we are expecting here. Public finance, including sharing of cash, how we are going to do that. The critical question he was putting on was, most of the thinkers in Nepal, they prefer for free market. But in our conditions, can we be absolutely in favor of market conditions or market philosophy? That leads us to think twice. That's why the Constitution of Nepal says that we have 3 pillar economy: government sector, private sector, and in between the non-government organizations, including Saja cooperatives. Because Saja also is mobilizing more than 3 billion worth of resources. That is not less in our economy. Therefore, the choice between them should be a very wiseful one, and they should be treated as complementary. The local body had to charge more than 56,000 rupees to clear the debris because of the marriage. Similarly, we can cite the example of, say, Zuckerberg can come from the free market, and so many things may happen. They also are trying to do little bit for the society. Anyway, however, Constitution guides us to go forward in that direction. Inclusiveness and efficiency. Definitely, there is very lean area to be relied on. Once, when I was to just address the parliament, I said that though our constitution is inclusive, participatory, because of that, our backward classes people are getting benefit, but other section of the population is complaining that those who are inferior in their education are getting good opportunity to become the doctor and engineers. That's why some very untoward events are taken place. For example, in Chittagong, one doctor operated the wrong leg. When I was citing this, there was very vehement opposition within the parliament. Therefore, there are certain grey areas to be stepped in. That is the responsibility of the government to balance both of these ideas is the responsibility of the government. He has pointed out very explicitly that unfortunately he was called from the parliament as well. He is leaving. Anyway, I will cut short. I don't want to be very loud person because everybody knows what is happening in Nepal. However, I have to just two things to be told. He extolled that the community forestry, it is one of the leading sector to be followed by rest of the world. Many people come to observe how our forestry is being managed. Second was community health. The World Health Organization remunerated us, honored us, because we had very good result because of the health volunteers, especially the women. They hanged out in the village areas. Luckily, this time, Honorable Minister has increased little bit of work to them. It is a welcome spirit. The first, another incident or the better thing of Nepal was we organized small farmers group, and with the group activities they were able to uplift the economic condition of themselves. That also was very instrumental. Many wanted to copy. Therefore, we also have some very illustrative examples. But the thing is, what we advocate and what we practice, there is a gap between these two lines. If we can minimize, definitely we can learn a lot from our neighbors, and we can also teach little bit whatever we have achieved from us also. With these remarks, I want to close here. Though his presence is not there, for his excellent deliberation, once again, let us thank him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Now we will have a break for 15 minutes, and then we will have a different technical session at different hall. So we will meet you at 12 o'clock. Thank you.